I'm an alcoholic. My name is John Williams. How y'all doing? Why don't we open this meeting with a moment of silence? And I want you to take that moment too, because I'll give it to you. And just think about, so close your eyes and just begin to think about how grateful we are to be a member of Alcoholics Anonymous today, have an opportunity to gather together. And we'll all say the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Back in 1979, my sponsor, Wesley Parrish, who passed away in 1985, a lot of you didn't get a chance to know Wesley, but his picture's up here. He was as good as he looked, and he met Charlie and Joe at some kind of a gathering out in Omaha, Nebraska. They were doing some sort of a big book workshop on a Saturday afternoon, and Wesley walked in there, and when he walked in there, by his own words, he heard music like he had never heard before. And I'm not talking about music. I'm talking about the music of the book. It just rang and sang to him. And there's no doubt in my mind, based on what happened, that he thought, because Wesley, you got to know Wesley to know he was a doer. And he said to himself, these two guys, it was Charlie and Joe McQueenie, these two guys are a valuable asset, and I think more and more of us need to hear what they had to say. So he began to do some things. The first little subtle thing that he did was the 1980 International Convention. He put on some sort of a luncheon just before the official start of the International Convention because they didn't want him to have, it wasn't part of the official stuff. So he had this luncheon. Lois was there. And as part of this festivities, he gave away 100 sets of what was available at that time of Charlie and Joe doing the Big Book study. It was 4 tapes, a couple, 3 hours of stuff. And Wesley, being cunning, had already planned to use these guys, and he wanted to see what some of the other members of AA thought of this flavor. And these 100 sets of tapes that were given away, he knew exactly who was going to win them. He was in charge of the seating arrangement, as was everything else. And he knew where so-and-so was going to be sitting, and he put one of them little green circles under his chair and made the announcement, hey, look under your chair. If you have a little green button under there, you win a set of tapes. Well, 100 of them folks did, and he knew who they were. And then when he got together with them after the International, he had made a request. He said, I want you to listen to them and write and call me and let me know what you think of it. Got some good favorable response. And then that was 1980. Then in 1982, he did a trial run with these two guys in Swanee River Retreat of some sort. I couldn't make it. I was supposed to make it. But he was auditioning these guys to some of his friends. And very favorable response. And so he began to put together what is known as a Big Book seminar. And when he started putting it together, of course, I was one of his favorite little pigeons. He called me over one day and he said he was working on this program and he handed it to me. He said, here, take a look, see what you think about this. I looked at it. And at that time, he had us starting at 1 o'clock on Thursday, and we were going to go till about 10 o'clock that night, maybe 10:30. And then Friday, it was 9 in the morning till 10 o'clock at night. And Saturday, it was 9 o'clock till 10 o'clock at night. And Sunday, half a damn day. I said, when are we going to dance? What about the golf tournament? What about tennis? What about those things? See, I had only been to these fun and fellowship weekends where that's what they did. You know, had speakers every few hours, and maybe a workshop on Saturday afternoon, and that was all I was used to. And I said, hell, I want to dance here. I said, this shit ain't going to work. I mean, that's about the way I said it. I said, this ain't going to work. And then he said, well, I think it will. I said, what about all? And he said, well, this is strictly business. This is all about recovery. It's none of that other nonsense. I said, well, Wesley, it ain't going to work. I can't imagine. I mean, I can't imagine me sitting down and listening to somebody yap about that for all that time. It just drive me crazy. Then he made a statement. He said, oh, by the way, I want you to be part of this program too, John. I said, give me that schedule back. Let me take a look at that. I said, you know what? I think this damn thing will work. What do you want me to do? So he got me involved with the 12 and 12, and thank God he did. We had our first Big Book seminar at Palm Air in May of 1983. In the beginning, from 1983 to 1986, we had them twice a year. He had an autumn Big Book seminar and a spring Big Book seminar. Wesley was that way. He liked the flowers. And then he passed away in November of 1985, but we were already scheduled for 86, so we did the two in 86. And then after that, we went to once a year. So that's why, even though we've been at it since 1983, which is 22 years ago, we were in our 27th Big Book seminar. So I know some of us are anal about those kinds of things. We've got to make sure it all works. So I just know we had 2 a year to begin with. So that's how we got 27 out of 22. You got to know these things. Well, he had asked me to do a little history of the writing of the Big Book. I said, I don't know anything about it. And then he told me where it was. He said, it's in AA Comes of Age. He said, haven't you read that? I said, well, I scanned through it. And he told me which page to go to. 183, whatever it was. He said, you start there, and then that's the story of the writing of the Big Book. He said, that's what I want you to talk about. Give it some life. So I've had the privilege of doing that since then, but then a little bit later, Joe McQuaney of Charlie and Joe had put together some information about the evolution of alcoholism in this country. And I think it's fascinating information for us to know how we are into the context of treatment of alcoholism and how blessed we really are. To be, when we reach our point of desperation, we have a place to turn to. It hadn't always been that way. It has not always been that way. So let's take a quick look at what we have done in this country. And every country's got its own story, but hey, am I interested in England right now? No. How about America? That's good enough for me. And he put together some things, and I'm going to go through them. I'm going to go through them slowly to show you how even over 250 years ago, whatever it was, from 1785 to now, how many years is that? That's a long time. And in 1785, Benjamin Rush was a. Let me just tell you about Benjamin Rush so you get a sense of who he was. I have a thing on Benjamin Rush, and I want to share it with you. We like to make sure that we get as much information as we can to show you about Benjamin Rush. This is at the time of his death in 1813, Dr. Rush was heralded as one of America's three most notable men, along with George Washington and Ben Franklin. So he was in pretty good company, wasn't he? He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. That's a typo thing. Served under 3 presidents, assisted in founding 5 universities and colleges, and personally trained over 3,000 medical students. So he was no slouch. So he wrote, and he did a study on us. I say us loosely, but he did a study on us, and he wrote a paper. I happen to have a copy of it here. It's amazing. I have a copy of it here, and here's the title of it. An inquiry into the effects of ardent spirits upon the human body and mind, by Benjamin Rush. Now, as I said, he was a notable man in those days. One of the three most popular men in the country at the time, behind Ben Franklin and George Washington. And he wrote this, and this is why he studied us. The beginning of the alcohol problem in America have been traced to the latter half of the 17th century. The importation of large quantities of molasses from Barbados, which began then, led to the development of the manufacture of rum. They liked their rum in those days. By the middle of the 18th century, rum had become an almost universal drink. And drunkenness had become rather obtrusive. Many leaders of public opinion, including Benjamin Franklin, Oliver Wolcott, Timothy Dwight, then president of Yale College, remember him, expressed their concern over the growing proportion of the problems arising from the widespread and copious drinking of spirits. They were concerned that this country, being as young as it was, might go under because it would raising a bunch of drunks. And so he wrote this paper about it, and in it he described the effects, because he was an observer. How many of you spent hours and hours just watching us operate? So he did, and he wrote about it, and here's how he described you and me in those days. The effects of ardent spirits divided themselves into such as are of a prompt and such as are of a chronic nature. I don't like the way they wrote in those days. You know what I mean? The former discovered themselves in drunkenness, and the latter in a numerous train of diseases and vices of the body and mind. He said, I shall begin by briefly describing their prompt or immediate effects in a fit of drunkenness. Now, he's describing a drunk. This odious disease, listen to what he calls it, a disease. He knew it was a disease. He knew that was the problem, and he knew that the answer to that was total abstinence, but he had no way of bringing that back, or bringing that about, rather. This disease appears to more or less of the following symptoms, and most commonly in the order in which I shall enumerate them. So they happen in this order. Listen to this. Unusual garrulity. That's literally made all the noise. Then, on the other end, unusual silence. A disposition to quarrel. Can you believe that? Huh? Uncommon good humor and an insipid simpering or laugh. Profane swearing and cursing. A disclosure of their own or other people's secrets. A rude disposition to tell those persons in company by whom they know they're false. Some things never change. Certain immodest actions, I am sorry to say, this sign of the first stage of drunkenness sometimes appears in women who, when sober, are uniformly remarkable for chaste and decent manners. However, give them a drink and it all goes to hell. A clipping of words, fighting, a black eye, a swollen nose, often mark this grade of drunkenness. Where's my next page? Oh, here we go. Certain extravagant acts which indicate a temporary fit of madness. These are singing, hallooing, roaring, imitating the noises of brute animals. Jumping, tearing off clothes, dancing naked. Oh, we like that. Breaking glasses in China. Oh, I just love that. Walk in the house and just start tearing shit up. You know, we do that. And after a while, drunkenness is completely formed. The face now becomes flushed. Red, flushed. The eyes project, bulge, and are somewhat watery. Winking is less frequent than usual. They don't wink. They just kind of slow down. The head inclines a little to one shoulder. The jaws fall. I like that when they fall. Belching and hiccups take place. The limbs totter. The whole body staggers. This unfortunate subject of history next falls on his ass. He looks around him with a vacant countenance and mutters inarticulate sounds to himself. He attempts to rise and walk. You know he can't get up. In this attempt, he falls upon his side. At least he didn't fall on. He falls on his side and he gradually turns upon his back. He now closes his eyes and falls into a profound sleep, frequently attended with snoring and profuse sweats, and sometimes with which a relaxation of the muscles which confine the bladder and the lower bowels so as to produce a symptom which delicacy forbids me to mention. Shit his pants. Now, in this condition, he often lies from 10, 12 to 24 hours or 2 to 3 to 4, 5 days, an object of pity and disgust up to his family and friends. Can't you just see us laying around, passed out, friends having to step over us? Oh, man. You know what? He had us pegged pretty well, didn't he? It's sad when you hear this description, although I make fun of it, but it's sad. I mean, I can see myself there. His eyes open and he closes them again. You know, we don't wake up, we come to. He gapes and stretches his limbs, and then he coughs and he pukes. His voice is hoarse. He rises with difficulty and staggers to a chair. His eyes resemble balls of fire. His hands tremble. He loathes the sight of food. He calls for a glass of spirits to compose his stomach. Give me a damn drink. And now and then he emits a deep-fetched sigh, a groan from a transient twinge of consciousness, but he more frequently scolds and curses everything around him. Isn't that what we did when we came out of it? He remains for 2 or 3 days before he's able to resume his former habits of business and conversation. And now that guy had us pegged pretty well. That was Dr. Benjamin Rush. And he said it was a disease. Is that what we know today? It is a disease. And the only answer to that is total abstinence. And he knew that, but he didn't have a clue as to how to do that. His movement led to, as a matter of fact, he had this thing, and you're not going to be able to see this all the way in the back, and there's nothing in your folder about this, but I found this. And if you're on the internet, go to Benjamin Rush. You'll probably find this stuff there. That's where I found it. Now, he had this thermometer of temperance and intemperance. And if you just drink water, you're going to have health and wealth. But if you get down, it looks down here at number 10, strong beer, you're just about to jump into intemperance. Then he starts saying there's toddies, there's grog, there's whatever this stuff is they used to drink, leads to vices, disease, and punishment. And you wound up, where the hell did you wind up? You wound up either committing suicide, an alcoholic death, or you go to the gallows. Not a good outcome for us, is it? That was your outcome in the 1780s if you were an alcoholic like we were. So he put that thermometer together and started talking about temperance, and that led to a movement in 1813 called the Temperance Movement. Now, they thought that the problem was drinking, and it was a social behavior. That would, you just develop bad habits. And so their idea was to temper the drinker. That is, moderation, please. But no matter what, if you take 100 people who drink, 10% of us are going to be continuing to drink until we get drunk. And so they didn't have any way to bring that about. They just said, what's wrong with you? Why? I don't do that. Why can't you exercise a little willpower, for God's sakes? Are you crazy? You drink. Look at what happens when you drink, and here you are drinking again. That's the kind of stuff they heard. I heard some of that too when I was drinking. Then they got tied up with this guy by the name of Lyman Beecher. Lyman Beecher. He was a. Damn, I had a picture of him too somewhere around here. But Lyman Beecher was a guy who said, and he got tied up with this temperance movement. He was a preacher. He said, it's a sin and people are weak. That's why they drink. Sin. Weak. And the only answer to that is total abstinence for everybody. Let's get rid of that booze. And here was their thought. Let's temper the drinker. Let's educate our young children not to drink. And eventually the drunks will die off. That was our outcome. I didn't like that solution. But, they had no way of bringing about anything in terms of recovery. They didn't know recovery. They just thought, well, hey, I'll just hit you upside the head with a sobriety wand and you'll be okay. I'll sprinkle you with a little sobriety dust. You'll be all right. Then that moves us into the Washingtonians. Now, here's something. Now AA knows about the Washingtonian movement because this was an outfit started by alcoholics for drunks. It started in 1840 in a little tavern in Maryland, Chase Tavern. You can find these stories in our history books. I'm not the only one around that knows this stuff. You can expose yourself to this information too, and it's worthwhile knowing. The Washingtonians thought that the problem was moral weakness. Total abstinence was the answer, and they thought that just their gatherings, and here's what they used to do. They used to gather, and they'd have an alcoholic speak to the other alcoholics. And in a short period of time, within a year or two, this outfit had over 500,000 members. At a time when we didn't have internet and telephones and all that kind of stuff. And if you look at the history of the Washingtonians, you'll see how they did it. Because when you study our history, you say in 1939 there was 100 of us sober, because that's what the book says, 100 men and women. And then in 1941 there was about 4,000 sober. At the end of 41, after the Saturday Evening Post article, there was about 8,000. But here we're talking 500,000 people in a couple of years. As a matter of fact, their second year anniversary, their keynote speaker was none other than Abraham Lincoln. So how did they do that? Well, it's simple. It's not complicated because part of their deal was they had dues. It cost 25 cents to join. Now, we don't have any of that. And then the dues were 12.5 cents a month, which is good. But they say, well, how the hell all these people get together like that? And he said, well, here's how it works. The requirement was that if you went to a Washingtonian meeting, you had to take somebody with you. That was a requirement. So if there's 8 of you here this week, guess how many there'll be there next week? 16. And if there's 16 of them that week, how many is going to be there the next week? Whatever it is. I can't add that fast. So you see, in a short period of time, you can see how there's some, what do they call that stuff where it mathematically expands? That too. That's how they got them numbers. A lot of people in a short period of time. Then we have, the next thing came along was the Emmanuel Movement. These folks were on to something. They thought that part of the problem was psychological. That we weren't thinking well. We couldn't see trouble standing right in front of us. And they said, there's something wrong with these folks. And so they thought that it was psychological, and they thought that the way to get somebody sober was to have them go through a spiritual experience. Their book that was their recommended reading was by William James. We know William James. And then the next thing we have, well, we have these two things that happen together. One is the Oxford groups. Now, we're getting real close to AA with the Oxford groups, but there was something else that occurred. Remember this? Have you ever heard of this? The United States government says, hell, well, I know how to handle this deal. We'll just outlaw drinking. And all, of course, they did was they were just able to keep a lot of people rich. Created a few gangsters, which, they make good movies about that today. So, it was called, and I got it here, the Volstead Act. Here we go. It was our government's attempt. You know how government is. Hey, got a problem? We'll solve it. No problem. 1919, they passed this amendment. It says you can't drink, closing all establishments, you can't make booze. Of course, there was a few smart boys those days that said, you can't quelch the thirst of an alcoholic, can you? No way. They'll find a way. They made their own, and of course they imported a lot of stuff. But it became void in 1933, which is a nice time span for us, with the repeal of prohibition, the 21st Amendment of the Constitution. So, that led to the Oxford movement, which was started by not Benjamin Rush. What's the boy's name? Frank Buckman. Frank Buckman. Want to see Frank? Let's get a picture. Frank's in the picture. He's around here somewhere, and we've got a big picture of Frank. But let's just so you know who he is. There he is. Born in Pennsylvania, June the 4th, 1878. And he was traveling in England after leaving a boys' school in Pennsylvania. He left because of a resentment. And while he was in England, he underwent a spiritual experience in a church in Keswick, Cumbria, which altered the course of his life. And he described it this way. I began to see myself as God saw me, which was a very different picture than the one I had of myself. Boy, when you can get out of the realm of self and think about it in those terms, you see a different picture. I realized how my sin, my pride, my selfishness had eclipsed me from God. He had separated himself from God with his ego, right? The big I had to be crossed out. It produced a vibrant feeling as though a strong current of life had suddenly been poured into me, and the man was never the same after that. He had a spiritual experience, and eventually got tied up with a bunch of students at Oxford University. They were traveling one time on a train as a group, and the conductor says, we have to identify you. And so Frank says, well, we're the Oxford group. And that's how they got their name. I mean, there's no big story to that. It's simple as that. Now, then we're getting closer to home because we have Dr. Silkworth involved. Dr. Silkworth was the attending physician for Bill. Towns Hospital. He was a well-trained. What do they call him? I mean, what kind of a doctor? Neurosurgeon, I think it was. He was a well-trained neurosurgeon. Because of the depression, took a job at Towns Hospital treating drunks. And, of course, one of his patients was Bill Wilson. Bill Wilson started going to Towns Hospital to get off the sauce, and, of course, met Dr. Silkworth. The second time he was in the hospital, he heard Dr. Silkworth tell his wife that if Bill continues to drink, he'll be dead in a short period of time, or he'll go crazy. And when Bill heard that, he left the hospital and stayed sober for a period of time on fear, the fear of dying. And then when he was in there for the third and final time, he had, which I will talk to you in a moment about, this white flash spiritual experience in December of 1934, which altered and changed his life forever. And Bill was to never drink again after that. So, but Dr. Silkworth is the one who wrote the doctor's opinion in the big book. And Dr. Silkworth, if you will consider the times and the way society thought about alcoholics, he was taking a tremendous leap by talking about alcoholism being a disease. Because everybody else says, you're crazy. There ain't no disease. They're just weak-willed people. And so he wrote the doctor's opinion, and of course you'll see in there he was astute enough to say this, that unless you and I, as alcoholics, are willing to go through an entire psychic change, very little hope of recovery. And that is really the message that he gives us. And I say, if you're a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, you've got to understand that very clearly. That you can't keep on being who you've always been and be sober. Oh, you may abstain for a while and maybe for a long while, but you won't be sober. Because you have to go through an entire psychic change. There was great information, and I focus on it a lot in talking about sobriety. Because he gave me a great message. I saw that. I underlined it. He said, oh, no, not a partial change. Can't I just change a little bit here and a little bit there? Keep what I want? Hell no. An entire psychic change is just what it says. Entire. That means everything. Then in our book you'll see there's a little story of the businessman on page 27 who went to see this guy, Carl Jung, in Switzerland, spent a year there. Now, this guy had some bucks, didn't he, to go to Zurich, Switzerland and spend a year under the counsel of Dr. Carl Jung. And he was an alcoholic, and he was being treated by the best. Carl Jung was his therapist. And helped him understand all the trigger mechanisms. And well, you can tell how I feel about that, don't you? And he was able to tell Roland that he thought he was well enough to go back to the United States. Roland says, hey, I've got enough self-knowledge now. I know what triggers it, and I'll go back. I'll be all right. And then he goes back to the United States, and within a short period of time, he's drunk as ever. Then he goes back over to Zurich. Says, hey, Dr. Jung, what the hell? That didn't work. And triggers, all this psychotherapy stuff, it ain't working for me. He said, well, I don't know. He says, I've never seen a man like you recover. He said, you'll probably have to get a bodyguard. You may be locked up, but if you continue to drink, you're going to die. Roland said it sounded to him like the gates of hell had closed on him. And they had. And Roland, in his desperate plea, says, God, doctor, isn't there any other way? And this is when Carl Jung gave us the definition of a spiritual experience. And he said, yes, every now and then, once in a while, Roland, someone like you recovers. They have what I call a vital spiritual experience. And I can just hear Roland saying, what is that? And Carl Jung says that is a huge emotional displacement and rearrangement. Whereas you get rid of your old ideas, your old beliefs, your old ideas, and you replace them with something new. He said, I've been trying to bring that about with you for the last year and a month or two, and the hell I ain't had any luck. So Roland says, well, God, he says, I'm a man of the church. He said, that ain't got nothing to do with it. So what am I going to do? He says, here's all the only advice I can give you, and this was the advice he gave Roland. I can only suggest you go back to your country and immerse yourself in some sort of a spiritual environment. Which he did. He came back here and he got himself tied up with the Oxford groups. He died sober. So, and as a matter of fact, he was part of that Oxford people that brought the message to Abby Thatcher, Bill's friend, who brought the message to Bill. So, a wonderful chain of events began to happen. And then when Bill got sober, he was able to see and put everything together. He took Dr. Silkworth's description of the disease as being a statement of the problem. We're powerless over alcohol. And then he took Carl Jung's spiritual experience description with Roland Hazard, who brought the message to Abby Thatcher, who brought the message to Bill Wilson. And step 2 was understood that there was a power greater than I am that is the solution to my problem. If I'm powerless, the answer has got to be power. And then he took what Abby had brought to him, what is called a 6-step program. And here's something interesting. I asked Frank Mauser years ago, who was the archivist at General Service Office at that time, and he said to me, I didn't ask him, but he just volunteered. He says, we have researched the Oxford literature inside and out. And he says, we never found them 6 steps. So I don't think Abby was smart enough to dream them up. Somebody must have gave them to him in the order in which Bill remembered them. And it was the 6 steps which provided a planned program of action which brought about the solution. Old attitudes, old ideas, old emotions were cast aside. And a new set of attitudes and ideas came into play as a result. And that's, in essence, what Alcoholics Anonymous is all about. We're here today because Bill Wilson was able to imagine that, picture that, put it into words known as a big book. That if we follow these instructions, and he wrote it for people like you and me, alcoholics writing about alcoholics, it's not that difficult to understand. But sometimes we like to read the white between the lines. So our purpose here this weekend is to try to focus on the black on the page. So, now, Bill Wilson got sober in 1934. I told you that. Then Bill Wilson was in a desperate state in 1935 when he was in Akron, Ohio, and he met Dr. Bob. He went there and had the biggest disappointment that he had had in his 5 years of sobriety, or 5 months of sobriety, by losing this business deal. He went out there on a proxy fight. And he thought, well, if everything goes well, I'll be a CEO next week. Of course, it went south. And it went south because he had some enemies. And they called some of them folks in Akron, Ohio, and said, yeah, Bill Wilson's coming out there. You know what a sot he is? God, you sure don't want to have him in to have anything to do with your company. And so he went downside. And he lost out on the proxy fight. And, of course, he didn't get what he thought he was going to get. So one Mother's Day afternoon in 1935, May of 1935, he was in this hotel that he was staying in, had very little money in his pocket. And you got to picture yourself in this situation. Just got slapped upside the head with a 2x4 by this operation. You came to Akron, Ohio, saying, "Man, I'm gonna go home a CEO," and you're nothing and nobody in the hotel, and you're drunk. You're only 5 months sober, and you're standing in there Sunday afternoon. It's Mother's Day. Lois is way back in New York City, and he hears some little noise down the hallway, a little tinkling of glasses, and started sniffing a little Chanel number 5, and then he said, "Man, I got to find me somebody to talk to. Not for them, but for me." He says, for the last 5 months, every time I talk to somebody about my drinking, hell, I got through it. So he went into this church directory at the Mayflower Hotel and pulled off some names. One of the last ones on the directory was a fellow by the name of Reverend Walter Tunks. Now, Walter Tunks was the head of the Oxford group in Akron. God, what a connection! There he was. Bill calls him up, and Walter, and here's how Bill's pitch. He says, "I'm a rumhead from New York. I'm looking for another drunk to talk to." And so Walter Tunks gave him a list of names, and the last name on the list that he gave was a lady by the name of Henrietta Seiberling. Now, Henrietta was also a member of the Oxford group. And she had been trying to get Dr. Bob more involved so that he'd get sober. But Dr. Bob wasn't having any luck. And so when Bill calls Henrietta up, he said, "I'm a rumhead from New York looking for another drunk to talk to." She said, "Well, come on over." Now, you think about that. If you got that kind of a message today, being who you are, would you say, "Come on over"? Hell no, you wouldn't say it. But she did, and you know why? Because part of what the Oxford group did was pray for guidance. And she didn't have any doubt that this guy calling was because she had prayed that morning for guidance or some way to help Dr. Bob. And she called Dr. Bob up. She called over to Dr. Bob's house, and Ann answered the phone, and she said, Henrietta says, "Ann, is Dr. Bob there?" She said, I got this guy coming over. He's an alcoholic from New York, and he wants to talk to somebody about drinking. And Dr. Bob would be a good candidate. And Ann says, "Well, Henrietta," he said, "I'm so sorry. You know it's Mother's Day. Dr. Bob just got home a few moments ago. He brought me a potted plant, but he's potted on the floor himself." So, but they made arrangements to see each other the next day. And Dr. Bob, in his story, he says, on the way over, "I'm going to give this guy 15 minutes. And they said, "I know I'm going to be thirsty as hell, so that's it." But he went, when they finally got together, it was magic. They spent hours together, 3 or 4 hours together. And Dr. Bob, in retelling it, he says, "This was the first man that I had ever talked to that knew what he was talking about when it came to drinking." And they said, "Hey, he didn't talk about my drinking, he talked about his drinking." Boy, there was just magic flying. And of course, of course, Dr. Bob drank again, but on June the 10th, he had his last drink. June the 10th, 1935, we just celebrated 70 years. 70 years of salvaging lives. Boy, I'm telling you, you and I are fortunate people when you think about it. So Bill eventually, he spent a lot of time with Dr. Bob out there. They got the third man sober, Bill Dotson, who was an attorney, who was in the hospital locally. He came from Kentucky. He liked to beat up nurses. And Dr. Bob and Bill went in to see him. He got sober. They got involved in the Oxford group meetings in Akron, Ohio, and they made friends, and alcoholics were coming, and they were commingling, the alcoholics and the Oxford people. And the outcome of that was Bill eventually went home about September. He never did work. Bill never did get a job. So, sounds familiar to some of us? And he went back to Akron, Ohio in the fall of 1937. And in the fall of 1937 is where the story of the big book begins. Bill was back on another business trip that went south. But while he was in Akron, he had a chance to go see Dr. Bob, and I could just see him on the front porch of Dr. Bob's house, recalling what was going on in their lives. And they were surprised. They started counting up. Well, he says, "There's Clarence over in Cleveland, and there's so-and-so over in Akron. We've got 16 or so here in Akron, and there's a few over there in New York City. And hell, there's 40 people. staying sober in this word of mouth program we got. Then they got to thinking, how many other thousands upon thousands of people that need to hear what we know? And they said, boy, we need to do some things. We need to build some hospitals to treat alcoholics, because you know these hospitals don't want to have us in there. And then we got to hire some missionaries. Yeah. You know who was going to be the head missionary. And carry this message. And then we got to write some literature. He said, we got to write down what's working for us, so that the message would not become garbled and twisted. So that's why we have a book. Then Dr. Bob, he's a simple man, and he says, Bill, this sounds a little complicated to me. He says, let's take it before the group tonight. And so they met at Clarice Williams' home. T. Henry and Clarice Williams, they were Oxford group people. They weren't alcoholics, but they offered their home for meetings. These things that these Oxford group people used to have, these things that they haven't, they call them house parties. It's almost like Tupperware, but they don't sell nothing. But they met there, and Bill brought up these ideas: hospitals and missionaries and literature. These guys said, hey, that hospital sounds like business. Missionaries? Hell, I'm lucky to have a job. I can't missionary nothing. And literature, here's where there's literature. You don't need literature. After all, the 12 apostles didn't have any. You see where they were coming from. And so, but Bill kind of backed Bill, Dr. Bob kind of backed Bill up. And then they had a vote. And according to the literature, by the barest majority. So if there's 18 there, what do we got? 10? 10-4. Yes, let's go for the whole package. Bill, good luck in New York City. You know there ain't nothing in Akron for you. So Bill goes back to New York City and breaks the news. Hey, man, this is what we're going to do. And they started trying to raise money to do these things. They went knocking on these doors of these rich people and said, hey, listen, we are alcoholics and we're looking for some contributions. And you can just imagine the response. You being a sober member of society with a few coins in your pocket, and the drunk comes knocking on you. We have something for you. And of course, they didn't have any luck raising a nickel. They didn't get a penny. And then, about this time, in comes this guy who was Bill Wilson's, one of Bill Wilson's proteges. His name was Hank Parkhurst. He got sober in Towns Hospital, and he was the first guy to stay sober for a period of time. And when he heard what Bill was doing, he jumped in. And you just got to read the description of Hank Parkhurst. He says to Bill, Bill, she says, in order to make this thing work, he says, we got to put this book deal on a business-like basis. He says, we got to sell stock. And Bill says, hell, we're not incorporated. We can't do that. I mean, it sounded complicated, but Hank says, no, don't worry about it. And the very next day, Hank comes in, and he's got he went to the bookstore, and he bought a packet of blank stock certificates, in which across the top he wrote, Works Publishing Incorporated, Hank Parkhurst, President. He said, what else you got, Bill? And so Bill says, that ain't not going to work. He says, I know if we give them a good enough deal, they'll cough up the money. So they went around trying to get somebody to donate or buy these stock certificates for $25 a piece for this book they were going to write. And here's what they thought. They thought that they were going to sell literature by the trainloads. Why? Because the Oxford group people had sold literature by the trainloads. And who more desperate than an alcoholic to know how to get out of that mess? So they just thought it was a lock. But it wasn't a lock. They couldn't get anybody to come up with $25. You're dealing with drunks. If they had $25, they're thinking about relapsing. And so they didn't raise any money. Then Hank gets another idea. He says, Bill, let's do this. Hank was my kind of guy. He says, let's do this. Let's go to Reader's Digest and tell them about this book we're going to print, and tell them about. Something happened even before that. Let me get to this story. I'm not going by my notes. I'm trying to make this off the cuff, and I'm not doing it too well. But I forget some of the important stuff. After they had tried to raise this money, didn't have any luck, Bill got despondent. We'd call it depressed these days, but he got a little despondent. And he went to see his brother-in-law, Leonard Strong. We've got a picture of him around here somewhere. And Leonard Strong had always provided Bill with a nice, strong shoulder to lean on. And so he went to told Leonard Strong, he says, man, these rich people are so short-sighted. He says, man, we're on to something. And, of course, Leonard Strong saw what was happening to Bill. Bill was by this time 7, 8, 9 months sober. And he knew that whatever it was working for Bill and must be good. And so when Leonard Strong heard Bill tell of his tales of woe and not being able to raise any money, he says, listen, I used to know a guy that was connected to the Rockefellers. He says, if he's still alive, he may remember me. So Leonard Strong calls up over to the Rockefeller Foundation and talked to... I got to get my notes. Willard Richardson. And he did remember Leonard. I'm in here somewhere. I got to find this mess. He did remember Leonard Strong. And Leonard Strong says, I got my brother-in-law is sober about 8 or 9 months, and he's got something he thinks that works. He said, would you be interested in hearing? He says, yeah, come on over. Because these people were teetotalers. They liked that Volstead Act. They liked outlawing drinking. That's who the Rockefellers were. So he says, come on over and talk. And they went over and had a chat, and they arranged to have another chat. And they says, listen, Bill, you, Dr. Bob, Dr. Silkworth, and a few of your drunk buddies, come on over, and we'll bring some of our friends from the Rockefeller people, and we'll have a little meeting. And so they had this historic meeting, and when these people from the Rockefeller Foundation were there, along with these other drunks, they started pitching, and they told about their alcoholic misery and their recovery from it as a result of what they were doing. And one of the Rockefeller people said, well, this sounds just like first century Christianity. What the hell can we do to help? He didn't say hell. What can we do to help? And that's when Bill and that bunch started saying, well, we think we need hospitals. We think we need missionaries. And we got to write some literature to tell people how this thing works. And so the people from the Rockefeller folks were given the same argument that they were getting in Akron, Ohio. It sounds like too big a business, too much money involved, and so on and so forth. It said it might just spoil the goodwill of man to man that seemed to be working so well. But then they decided to make a study of alcoholics. It wasn't called Alcoholics Anonymous at that time. I don't know what the hell it was called, but it wasn't AA. And they said, we'll make a study, and we'll see if we can't make a recommendation to Mr. Rockefeller to fund you so that you can get started in these good works. So they sent Frank Amos to Akron. Frank Amos is one of the guys who was there at that meeting. And Frank Amos went to Akron, Ohio to look around. He attended some meetings. He talked to some people about Dr. Bob and how well he was doing, et cetera, et cetera. And he found a place there that could be easily converted into a hospital. And, of course, they had already decided that if there was to be a hospital, it was going to be in Akron where Dr. Bob could do it, could run it. Because, see, Dr. Bob, his practice hadn't been going too well. Dr. Bob was a proctologist. And his reputation always preceded him. And so they wasn't going to let Dr. Bob mess with their procto. So he wasn't, he was in desperate straits. He couldn't make no money because he wasn't good to be a drunk proctologist. I can tell you that much. So Frank Amos comes back, he makes his report, he gives it to Willard Richardson. He says, I recommend $50,000 just as a start. $50,000 in 1936 or 7 is a whole lot of money, folks. So then Mr. Richardson went it in, handed it to John D. Rockefeller, and then he added his own remarks about what he had seen and what he had observed, and thought it was good stuff. And John D. Rockefeller looked at the report, and he says, I think money will spoil this thing. He says, I think it will spoil the man-to-man approach that seems to be working now. He knew us better than we knew us, because he refused to give us any money. And it was at that time that Mr. Richardson told John D. Rockefeller, he says, listen, Dr. Bob is behind on his mortgage. These guys aren't working. What can we do to help them out? John D. says, listen, here's what I'm going to do for you. I'm going to put $5,000 of my money into the Riverside Church, which was his church. And he says, these guys can draw on it as long as it lasts. And once it's gone, please don't ever ask me for another nickel. And so, of course, it did salvage Dr. Bob's home. He was able to catch his mortgage up. And then, of course, they drew so much a week until it ran out. And, of course, in the meantime, they get to working on this this book project. And the first thing that they wrote was Bill's story. I mean, it was written before they really got started on the book. And they also wrote a chapter called, that we know today as There Is a Solution. So these were the two chapters that they had. Now they were going around knocking on doors and saying, we're so glad we're alcoholics, and we're here to see you about donating some money. Now, you don't know who we are, but these two chapters, they didn't call them chapters. He says, we have written a story about what a real alcoholic looks like, and we've written a story about there is hope for this alcoholic, and we need your help to do it. So they had these two chapters going. And then one day, Charlie Towns tells Bill, he says, listen, I got a friend. His name is Exman at Harper's Magazine. He's the religious editor. Go down and see him. I made an appointment. So Bill goes down and shows this guy the two chapters he had already written. Eugene Exman looks at him and he says, He says, can you write a whole book using the same style? Yeah, I can do that. How long do you think it'll take you? Oh, about 8 or 9 months. And Eugene Exman then made this statement. He says, listen, if you think it'll help you out, we can advance you $1,500. We'll take it out of the royalties when the book's published. Sounded like a good deal. And by this time, they had created a foundation, which ultimately turns into the General Service Office, but it was called the Alcoholic Foundation, in which they would meet periodically and look at an empty treasure and talk about what was going on. And so Bill was on his way back to talk to him about Eugene Exman and Eugene Exman's offer to them. Then on the way home, this is according to Bill, he says, he got to thinking about that. He said, that sounded like a good deal. He says, but I don't know. I think we ought to own our own literature. So when he went to the trustees to tell them about it, they said, well, we ought to take the deal. Bill had his reservations about him, and of course they walked away making no decision about it. Then this is when Hank Parkhurst gets involved in it with the stock certificates, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea, let's go down and talk to Reader's Digest. Let's drop a few names, like John D. is our friend. Gave us $5,000. It's got to be good. And they went down to see the managing editor, Payne, of the Reader's Digest. They went in there and dropped a few names and told them what they were and who they were. They were writing a book. Got to be published in a very short period of time. And Mr. Payne says, that sounds like something we would be interested in. However, I'll have to take it up with my managing editors and I'll let you know. Well, they left, headed back to New York with an endorsement. As far as they were concerned, Reader's Digest is going to publish an article when our book is ready. They went back, and sure enough, they were able to sell all of the stock certificates based on the idea that Reader's Digest was going to do an article on them. And they had created 600 shares, 2 to sell at $25 each, and they made it easy. $5 down, $5 a week. If you didn't have it all right now. I mean, they were good salesmen. And then the 200 shares would be for Bill as the primary author of the book, and 200 would be for Hank Parkhurst as the PR man. And so they had that all squared away. So they get to working on that book and working on it at a place that Hank Parkhurst had in New Jersey. Hank Parkhurst was in business. You know, he'd been hired by Standard Oil, and they fired him. Drinking. And probably as a means of getting back with them, he started this association of dealers. They gathered all these dealers together so that they, as a combine, would get a better price from the oil company. He's trying to get back at them, I'm sure. But he had this business, Honors Dealers is what it was called. And let's see. Bill went in there every day and started writing, dictating to Ruth Hawk, who was the secretary of this little outfit, dictating to her based on some chapter titles that Bill Wilson had written down. He would dictate them to her. She'd type them out. He'd take them that as soon as she was finished with them, send a copy to Dr. Bob, who said, "Hey, it's good stuff. You're doing a great job over there in New York. Keep it up." And then he would take what had been written to the meeting that night. Can you imagine? 15 or so of us sitting around. I'm Bill Wilson. I got this book. And here's what I've written today, boys and girls. I'm going to pass it out to you. Look it over. And as soon as you'd get it, you know what you'd say? Horse shit. This is, where do you get this stuff? This is no, who do you think you are? That's the way it was with me. And so he didn't get a lot of support. Dr. Bob's, good job, Bill. Keep it up. But not... Bill, take these things to the meeting. You know how we are. If I didn't do it, it ain't worth a damn. I mean, that's our attitude. If I didn't think it up, it's not a good idea. I can guarantee you that much. So that's the way it went until in the meetings when he just got them all again. Can you imagine, Bill, how frustrated he must have been that nobody appreciated or what he was doing? He many times he said, I felt like throwing that damn thing right out the window. Thank God he didn't. Chapter 5, Working with Others, was written in December of 1938. He was progressing, see? December 1938. How long is this? 4 years after he gets sober. 4 years after he gets sober. Look at the wisdom in chapter 5. At this point in the process, Bill was a little worried because he had never written anything. He was not an author. He was a correspondent lawyer, not a good one at that, and a stock manipulator from New York City. He didn't know how to write books. Progress had been slow, and the hassling over the first 4 chapters had been terrific. But he'd reached this place. He was not in a very spiritual mood that night, December 1938. At home, he was laying in bed with a pad and a pencil in his hand. You know, some of us do our best work in bed. He laid in bed with a pencil and a pad and reflected on all that had occurred since Abby first visited him in the fall of 1934. They had a word-of-mouth program, which most of the ideas came from the Oxford groups and from William James. See, when Bill was in that hospital in 1934, when he had his white flash spiritual experience, Abby had brought him the message of the Oxford groups. And when he had that experience, which is described in the big book, in his story, he felt as though something occurred. This white wind of spirit blew right through the room. And the next day, Abby comes to see him. And he has this book called Varieties of Religious Experiences by William James. So, now, Abby hands him the book, and Bill says, Abby, have you read this book? Abby says, no, I hadn't, but I heard it was good. So, Bill tried to read it. Have you ever seen a copy of that book? Oh, it's heavy. And Bill had trouble understanding and reading it. It's just like some people that you'll run into in Alcoholics Anonymous will get a copy of our book and say, I don't understand this stuff. Then Bill realized, what most alcoholics soon realize, that this book was written about his experience. It was trying to tell him what had happened and what he might expect. And when he realized that, he said he was able to consume the book. And so when you and I realize that this book called Alcoholics Anonymous was written for and about us, then you are able to consume it and understand it. But if you think it belongs to somebody else, oh, this will help you out, that ain't going to work. Silkworth, who had defined alcoholism as an allergy of the body and an obsession of the mind, it was followed by, because everybody who came into Alcoholics Anonymous had to understand Silkworth's position. Allergy of the body, which made sense. Doesn't it make sense? If you're told as an alcoholic that you keep drinking because when you take one drink, it sets up a phenomenal craving for another drink. You have this allergy that's aggravated when you drink. And he said, if you keep doing that, you'll get drunk. And then he says, it's bad enough that you get drunk, but as soon as you get out of it, you start making excuses for it. Wasn't my fault. I know, I mixed that beer and gin. It always happens that way. You're not going to take responsibility for it. So then, the rest of the program, as it looked like, this is what they were saying. This was these 6 little steps. We admitted that we were licked and that we were powerless. That was the first one. Then it says we got to make a moral inventory of our defects or sins. Then we got to confess our shortcomings with another in confidence. Then we got to make restitutions for harms done by our drinking, and we got to help others expecting nothing in return. Anonymity at its best. And we got to pray to whatever God we think there is to practice these precepts. This was in essence what the program looked like at that time. Everybody was using Silkworth's expression describing the alcoholic dilemma. And even by then they knew that the prospect had to accept excuse me. Turn that off for a second. Let me get okay. They had to accept that or get nowhere. But as he laid in the bed in December of 1934, reflecting over these things, he knew that he needed to put the spine or the backbone of the book right here. Then he said, before he started writing, after thinking about these things, he said he prayed for guidance. God, I need a little help here. I'm an alcoholic with no experience writing books, and here I am in the middle of one. So I need some help. Then Bill started writing with these thoughts in mind that I just mentioned. And he says, with speed that is astonishing. Took him about 30 minutes. Then he looked over his steps and he numbered them. And they wound up with 12. And Bill said he thought about the 12 apostles. And then shortly thereafter, a fellow came by to see him on the way home from a meeting with his protege. That's what they called him in those days. And Bill showed him what he had written, the steps. And the guy got upset. He says, you got too much God in here, Bill. What the hell's wrong with you? He says, well, what do you mean here, humbly on our knees? What's wrong with you? There's too much of that stuff in here, Bill. This is no good. Bill says, well, hey, this was written under the auspices of God. And the guy said, I don't give a damn who they were written by. It ain't going to work. And they didn't get quiet until Lois came in and says, shh, have some coffee. And they quieted down. Bill defended almost to a point of physical contact what he had written. He said it wasn't my, hell, I didn't do it. God did it. And you know, as I look back on it, I know God wrote it. I mean, I'm 30 years sober. Ain't no way I could write something that good, knowing what I know. So these visitors got into this heated discussion, and then they got into the completion of the book. And here's where you got to understand: we had 3 groups of people in AA. If you could break them down. And all of them played their part. You know, if we could probably break our numbers down into these three groups too, we had the conservatives. And I'm not talking about political stuff. I'm talking about the conservatives. At that time, they wanted a book written. They wanted a lot of God in the book. They wanted the God in the book, and they wanted even some quotes from the Bible even. I mean, this is who they were. Then they had the liberals. This was the middle of the ground. The bunch that says, we don't have any objections to the word or the term God, but we're against any theological or religious position. Spirituality, yes. Religion, no. That was the other bunch. And then they have the other end of the extreme, the radicals. Jimmy Burwell, Hank Parkhurst. They were atheists, more or less. They didn't want anything about God mentioned at all in the book. They wanted a book which was mostly psychological. Remember the Emmanuel groups? So Bill was caught up in all this bickering, all this fighting, and all this arguing, and by the different factions. And he said, I can just imagine. He said, I felt like throwing this book away. I didn't want to go on any further. And he finally cut a deal with them. Bill cut a deal. He said this. He says, listen, if you don't let me be the determining factor of how this book is written, you guys can write the damn thing and leave me out of it. And they were standing there looking at each other. Can you write anything? I can't right now. I never wrote nothing. I just barely signed my name today. So they decided, and they knew that they had to give in to that. They'd say, Bill, you the man. Do whatever you think is necessary. Just check it out with us. We'd like to just have some input. So then they decided about this time that there was something more needed in the book. Rather, you know, they have the first 7 chapters, and then they have the family afterwards, the wives, and so on and so forth. And you know, these alcoholics thinking, if we can leave it this way, this book ain't going to be but that big. And that ain't going to work. We got to make sure these people know they're getting the money's worth. So we need some stories in the back. We need some witnesses. And so they were able to get 36 stories together to include in the book. And then as they got closer to it, they figured, well, it was time to go down and see Mr. Payne at Reader's Digest and let him know, hey, they were about ready to give birth to this book. And they went down there and seen Mr. Payne. Mr. Payne's, they walked in the office and said, well, we're the boys from Alcoholics Anonymous. We're about ready to publish this book. He said, are you ready to do an article on it? And Mr. Payne looked at him and he had trouble remembering who the hell they were. He says, oh, yeah, I remember you two guys, but remember what I said. I said I had to take it up with my managing editors, and, you know, to my surprise, they were not in agreement with it at all. Too controversial and all that kind of stuff. So Bill and Hank went back to New York City just dejected and depressed and just out of sorts, and they were so amazed. And you know, the people that saw them says, hey, where's your faith? What's wrong with you? You know, cheer up a little bit. And it's going to be all right. It's going to be all right. And then one morning, there was a guy by the name of Morgan who knew what was going on. And he says, hey, Bill, he says, you know, I used to know a guy by the name of Gabriel Heater who was on the radio program. And he had a national hookup. From coast to coast, Gabriel Heater. I remember him as a kid. I heard Gabriel Heater. I didn't hear this thing, but he says, I'm going to go down and see Mr. Heater, and I'll report back to you. So he came back and says, guess what? Gabriel Heater is going to interview me in 10 days. I'm going to tell him a little bit about me, and then I'm going to put in a plug for the book. Now, Hank Parkhurst says, damn, that ain't great. Here's what we're going to have to do, boys and girls. He says, we got to send a postcard to every physician east of the Mississippi to tell them about this program and to put in a plug for the book and request that they buy one. And so they didn't have enough money to do that. They had to borrow money to do that. And then Hank says, you know, Morgan just got out of the insane asylum. He's liable to mess up. Given the way things are going, he's liable to mess up. What are we going to do? Hank says, well, let me think about this. They had a member who was a member of the athletic club in New York City, and they were able to talk him into letting him use that room, and they put Morgan in that room for 10 days with a guard on the door. So he wouldn't escape, so he wouldn't get drunk. So the day finally came when Morgan showed up, and everybody in AA who was in correspondence knew that the show was going off, and they were all tuned to their little radios that evening. And if you want to know what the transcript of that radio program is in the history book. No, it's not AA Comes of Age. The other one. Pass it on. That's it. Pass it on. It's in there. Pass it on. Now you can see why I'm getting out of this seminar there. Can't remember it. Shit. So Morgan does this deal, and then Hank, Ruth Hawk, and Bill Wilson wait 72 hours. Then they go down to the post office to pick up all these requests that they know are going to be waiting there. They each carried a suitcase down with them. Go down to pick up that mail, send them books out. They get down there and they look in this little window. They see a few little... And Bill's mouth drops, and Hank Parkhurst says, hey, don't worry about it. Hell, they got them in the bags in the back. They called the mail clerk over. And the mail clerk said, this is it. This is all there is. There was about 10 or 12 responses. Most of them you couldn't read because you can't read a doctor's handwriting anyway for the most part. And when you're drunk, you can't read nothing. They got one order of the book out of them. $400 spent on sending these postcards out. They got one book order. So then, eventually, Bill gets a chance to talk to Fulton Alsler, Liberty Magazine. They do an article on us in 1939. The book is finally published in April of 1939. And before they do this, Eugene Exman, they go down to put their order in, and Eugene Exman, who was a great friend of Alcoholics Anonymous, he says, well, how many do you want to do to begin with? And they said, how about 5,000? He said, well, that'd be good. How much you got to put down on this? About 500. And because Hank was thinking 10% was a good figure. But Eugene Exman was a little surprised at that low figure, but he went along with him. And then they went to the Cornwall Press to put the galleys together, and they made a request there. They said, we want this book written on the thickest paper you got, and we want the margins to be a little wide. The whole reason for that is they wanted it became a big book. He said that we wanted these people to think they were getting their money's worth for $3.95, and so. That's how it got its name affectionately called the Big Book, because it was big. And it was covered with this anonymous dust cover. Walk down the street. So they do this article. They start communicating with about 850 people. It sold a lot of books as a result of the Liberty article. In 1940, Hank got drunk over a dispute about where to locate the office and the office furniture. And during this time, Bill turned over his 200 shares to the foundation, and he talked Hank Parkhurst into doing the same thing. So there's another story behind that, but I'm not going to get into it. It has to do with some resentments from folks who were related to Hank Parkhurst, who later said, we were robbed. But